Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest, James Fleay. James is an Australian engineer and project manager who has worked in the power and oil and gas sectors. He's also been a solar industry investor and is the founder of Down Under Nuclear Energy. James was on the show, like I said, about 3 weeks ago, and we were talking about whether the left and right can come together to decouple. It was a very popular downloaded show. Highly recommend going back to check that out. But James, welcome back onto the program.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
So most of the listeners have a sense a bit of who you are, but if you want to give us a quick little self-introduction there. I know you're a father of 4 boys, I believe.
3. Yeah,
okay.
That's correct. Yeah. So I live in Western Australia. I grew up here. 3 boys. I've worked and continue to do work in the oil and gas sector, and have been working in the energy sector, both renewables and oil and gas and power generation for my career. So 15 years now. Yeah, I mean, there's not much more exciting information than that, to be honest. That's about it.
All right. Well, today's topic, I think, is kind of exciting. We're going to be addressing this issue of hydrogen, and it's in the sort of popular media, it's really kind of being framed, I think, as maybe a dominant future fuel, a panacea, a solution to some of the challenges of deep decarbonization, particularly when it comes to firming renewables. I mean, it's been on my horizon for a long time. I remember Arnold Schwarzenegger driving around in his hydrogen-powered Hummer and talking about how the only exhaust gases were water, and this miraculous machine. My uncle actually was working on hydrogen fuel cells, I think, in the early 2000s, and I think he decided at a certain point that this wasn't worth his energy. But certainly, like, in prepping for the show, it's very hard to find resources that I think have a critical eye to it. I did a show on fusion with Garrett Bruhag, I believe is how you pronounce his name, and I found that a little easier to prep for. And certainly it's similar. There's a lot of hype around fusion, and my intention here is not to sort of line up a bunch of technologies and trash them, but I do feel it's really important to bring a bit of balance to this and understand where we're at currently with hydrogen and where we can go potentially. And it's exciting bringing on an Australian, because I know there's certainly, I think your chief scientist has really endorsed a potential for a sort of Australian hydrogen future. So I'm really excited to have you on the show to delve into this topic. Where do you want to start with us, James?
Sure. So I guess when thinking about hydrogen, it helps to identify the fact that there is some hype, and we'll dig into that, and that there is some substance.
Yeah.
There's some really good reasons why we should be talking about hydrogen in a more sober manner than we are now, but 2 of these are worthy, like, interesting reasons, okay? And we can spend a bit of time discussing them. The first is decarbonizing the existing hydrogen sector. Okay, so
right.
we already have large amounts of hydrogen being produced from natural gas, mainly to make fertilizers in the Haber-Bosch process, but for other applications too. Okay, and that's already emitting a lot of CO2. So decarbonizing the existing hydrogen sector. The other reason it's worth talking about is for hydrogen potential, and I've used potential in air quotes there, to displace oil and gas in transport applications as a way to decarbonize and get on a more stable footing. That's a super interesting conversation, and I hope we can get on to that. So there are 2 good reasons to talk about hydrogen, but I don't think that's the reason we're hearing about hydrogen.
Right.
There's a newsletter put together by Ben Hunt and Rusty Quinn called Epsilon Theory. It's one of my favorites. And those guys are terrific at understanding and teasing out the narratives that are in play, and why they are being used and how they're being used to influence decision making and the way people think about things. And I always press readers in their newsletter to ask, why am I hearing about this now?
Mm-hmm.
So why are we hearing about hydrogen now? And unfortunately, I have a bit of a cynical view on this. Okay, hydrogen and its potential has been known about for a very long time. I mean, Hindenburg used hydrogen.
Right.
Back in 1966, Chevy prototyped the Electrovan. Okay, so fuel cells and hydrogen have been known about since then. Toyota has spent nearly 30 years working on hydrogen technology. Okay, so this is old news, but we're hearing a lot about it. And why are we hearing about it? And again, I don't want to dwell on this. My intent is not to trash any technology, but the spruikers and vested interests, let's say, in wind and solar have identified, I believe, that to keep the plates spinning, okay, to keep all the balls in the air with regards to intermittent renewable energy, they need hydrogen to work, and they need us to believe that hydrogen is a viable option to further extend the penetration of intermittent renewables.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I just want to be really careful because I don't want to come across as someone who is anti-solar and wind. Like in Australia, we have a long, spindly, thin grid, sparsely populated. We also have lots of sun, we have lots of wind, right? So there's lots of applications in Australia where solar and wind combined with some storage, maybe a little bit of diesel backup, makes a lot of sense. Lots of remote mine sites that run 100% on diesel. They still have to have that diesel infrastructure, but they can use solar really effectively to reduce their diesel costs and their carbon emissions. So there's lots of really good applications for it.
Mm-hmm.
But I do have a problem with 100%. People saying it's possible and even desirable to go to 100% renewable energy. And the people who are spruiking that need us to believe that hydrogen is the silver bullet that will take us there.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say most listeners on the show are probably reasonably comfortable, familiar with the issues of intermittency, both hourly, daily, weekly, annually, and with renewables, solar and wind. Okay, so we won't necessarily go into it, but the reason we're hearing about hydrogen in gushing, breathless terms with very, very little sort of clear-eyed critique of the pros and cons is because renewable energy advocates and special interest groups need us to believe it can extend renewables.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we're hearing about it now, make no mistake.
So James,
I don't know if you've got a comment. I mean, it's not something I really want to spend too much time on, but we can.
No, I think that's an important point. In terms of just kind of setting the terms for our discussion here, or understanding the background, I mean, we have to dive a little bit into some basic chemistry and science and engineering. I was fortunate to have my chief science advisor, Sean Wagner of the Alberta Nuclear Nucleus, sort of prep me a little bit for this interview, but I'm still, I'm a medical doctor. I studied chemistry and physics very much with an eye to getting a great mark on an exam, and promptly sort of forgot everything the day after. I've certainly had my interest in these core sciences rekindled, now that I'm really trying to understand energy, and climate change and, atmospheric science and these kind of things. I'm teaching my son, my 2.5-year-old, the periodic table right now. So he probably knows more than I did a few weeks ago. And I'm learning a lot in that process. We're up to, I think we got up to strontium, actually. It's pretty cute. But so hydrogen, one proton, one electron, the element number one. Something that was very interesting is that, I mean, it escapes really easily. And I think Earth is kind of unique in terms of retaining a lot of the hydrogen, but even on Earth, it's such a light gas, and it gets up to the upper troposphere, and then solar winds blow it away. Let's just talk a bit about the sort of fundamentals of what it is, and how that impacts how we can use it, how we can store it, what it does to materials, that sort of thing.
Sure. So For all intents and purposes, the hydrogen that we are talking about utilizing for energy purposes doesn't exist in nature. So yes, hydrogen is the most abundant element, but because of how reactive it is, it always exists bound to other molecules. And so we need to capture energy from a different source, be it solar, wind, nuclear. There's a raft of different ways we can do it. We need to capture energy from one of those sources and use that energy to wrangle the hydrogen element, the hydrogen atom, away from whatever it's attached to. Okay. And then combine with another hydrogen atom to make H2. Okay. So it's pretty straightforward. There's different ways this can be done. The way that's most common at the moment is to basically use a steam methane reformation process and generate hydrogen from natural gas.
So that's C4. So there's a bunch of hydrogen on there. You got to strip it away from that carbon molecule.
Yes, that's right, CH4. Yeah. So that's how we produce it now. It emits a lot of CO2 in order to do that.
Hey, that's because you need to generate the heat. You're kind of probably burning natural gas to generate the heat, and then your feedstock is methane, stripping the carbon off that. So okay, yeah.
Yes, so both it's both energy intensive.
Yeah.
And so there's carbon emissions involved with that. But the actual chemistry of the reaction, when you play that reaction through, one of the byproducts is CO2, a continuous stream of CO2, in order to separate the carbon from the hydrogen, capture the hydrogen. Something happens to the carbon, it ends up as carbon dioxide and goes into the atmosphere. So it's not just the energy, it's also the chemistry.
Right. I think that's one of the key distinctions. And I think part of the magical thinking sometimes is, stores of hydrocarbons, for instance, have been around for 300 million years, cooking under the surface of the earth. And then they're sort of for the taking. I mean, there's energy involved in extracting them and refining them. But hydrogen is very much something we need to kind of create de novo, and it's got a high energetic cost.
That is exactly the case, and that will be the difficulty and the complicating factor with any type of energy we try and capture and then utilize, particularly for transport. Transport's really a difficult one to decarbonize, because we will always the energy is not available in the same way it is with hydrocarbons, right? They come out of the ground. Perfect. The smallest amount of refining is needed before they can be used. And we can sort of go into the reasons why hydrocarbons are singularly useful later, but suffice to say that no alternative is that readily usable or energy dense.
So even hydrogen's not that energy dense. I think is it 40% of the energy density of fossil, and that's had implications, I think, in terms of in transport where it can be useful in terms of, in small vehicles it doesn't really make sense because the size of the tank. Is that right? Or
not quite. The reasons it doesn't really make sense with current technology, in my view, is not to do so much with energy density. Because you've got to compare against the alternatives, right? Okay, it's never going to compare with petrol or gasoline or diesel, but it compares pretty well with lithium ion.
Okay.
So have to, and it compares not too badly with methanol either. So you sort of just need to be a little bit careful about what you're comparing against. I actually don't think density is the biggest challenge with hydrogen, personally. The issues with hydrogen, to my mind, are more around how it's generated, how it's transported, and then how it's utilized, as opposed to just the simple energy density view. So we can go into some of the other aspects. I think you touched on embrittlement there.
Why don't we
You
start
know,
with you kind of laid it out there, I guess. Why don't we start with how it's generated? I know there's a whole kind of rainbow of colors to describe this. Can you briefly summarize that for our listeners?
sure. So there are lots of options for. Okay, let's wind back a little bit maybe and think about the problem that we're trying to solve. Let's say I mentioned earlier that the vested interests in solar and wind need us to believe that hydrogen will work. But what they're really talking about is grid scale hydrogen and grid scale storage. Okay, now that is probably the least sensible approach. It may not even be possible, but let's just say it is possible, or let's just say it's possible contingent on future technological development. It is far from the most sensible option to power the grid.
There was
And
I had an interesting discussion with Mark Mills, who we're going to be releasing that episode soon. But just in terms of this idea of this kind of could versus should, which I think comes up all the
absolutely.
time in talking about renewables, and 100% renewables in particular, because as you said, there's roles in certain scenarios. But he was saying, look at the helicopter versus the plane. The helicopter is a pretty miraculous piece of aviation technology. It has grown in its utility, but it still kind of has a more niche application. Could we set up transatlantic travel by helicopter? We could build a whole infrastructure, maybe sort of like floating refueling stations across the Atlantic. It's not very fast. It doesn't move a lot of people well. It's a could, but it's not, certainly not a should. And I think that applies to a lot of this kind of Rube Goldberg machine thinking about how do we force a solution out of wind and solar because we refuse to consider nuclear as part of the mix. I think that's kind of fundamentally what it boils down to.
That is exactly right. It's a really good example. I think Meredith Anglin's got a terrific example too. She talks about heavy haulage applications, and you could use like 1,000 Teslas to, or I think she says sports cars, actually 1,000 sports cars to transport like X amount of goods to the supermarket, or you can use one semi-trailer, right? So, and it's difficult for policymakers who haven't had the time to either study, the technology or the engineering implications behind it, to understand all these trade-offs. And there are always trade-offs, and so they can be presented with a single, let's say, scientific fact, which is at best a half truth, which might be, say, for example, for hydrogen, for example, it might be energy density. Okay, yes, it's not as good as diesel, it's not as good as petrol, but it's better than batteries. Okay, and so they go, this must be it. This must be what it's going to be, because look at the energy density. They look at one parameter. But we've been doing a little bit of work on transport decarbonisation, and so far we're up to 12 different parameters that we can identify, and we know we haven't finished. 12 different parameters that we can identify that describe different constraints and different trade-offs that have to be made. Energy density is only one of them. There's a whole raft of other ones. And so it becomes very difficult for policymakers to identify and to make sort of discerning judgment on what is possible contingent on some future technological development, which may or may not happen, and what is sensible. And in democratic countries, we need to be demanding our politicians try and find out, try and determine what is the sensible option, not what is possible.
It's interesting in a time when when we're making really consequential decisions when it comes to climate change and energy transition, that this is being driven especially in Western countries, by politicians who generally have no or very little science training. They're mostly lawyers. In the US, they're mostly millionaires. Maybe they have some technical or industrial background if that's the case. But you would imagine that you would have a sort of council of scientists and engineers, and certainly in Ontario, the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers have said, listen, like, consult us. Like, it should be engineers that are kind of giving you guys the advice and telling you about the implications of the various choices on the table. And, if you'd consulted us about, Ontario adding lots of wind to the grid, would have told you it's a bad idea, because wind profiles in terms of production versus grid demand do not match up at all, right? And we could have told you that, guys, but decisions are just not being made with enough input, I think, from STEM professionals.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think politicians are an easy target, and I'm as critical of them as anyone. The investment community also has to, shoulder a lot of the blame here, to be honest. If you look at where money is being invested now, if you look at where influence is being peddled in the way of lobbying or crafting taxonomy that favors a particular type of generation technology, that's really coming from the investment community in a huge way.
Right.
And again, that's sort of full of MBAs, accountants, lawyers. They have an important role to play, but they don't have the technical acumen to understand all the trade-offs.
Right.
Politicians have to rely on public service for advice, and that's fair, and that's a pretty reasonable system, I think. But one way that could be improved is, and I believe that this sort of approach was pioneered in the US defense, is to use like a red team, blue team approach.
Right. Right.
So, it's not enough for a minister, let's say, to be given an energy roadmap, for which he only has time to read the executive summary, and to be honest, only has the technical bandwidth to really even understand the technical summary, and then start making policy off it. Really, to give that minister the best chance of crafting legislation that is going to have impact over decades, okay, like the whole way through this century, he or she needs to be able to rely on a red team saying something and a blue team critiquing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't think there's anything wrong with a pro solar, pro wind, pro batteries, pro pumped hydro, pro hydrogen red team, pushing that and bringing out all the opportunities that there might be, and how costs could come down, and this, that, and the other. But that can't be enough in its own right. You also need a blue team who are saying, yeah, but what about this? And what about that? And what about this? And what about that?
Right.
So you really do need that red team, blue team approach. And I don't see that in any public policy around, particularly in energy.
Right.
But I think it's something that's worth considering.
Really useful detour, but let's try and cycle back a little bit more to the topic at hand. We were talking about the various ways to make it. I think my audience is pretty well educated. I don't think we need to dwell in tons of detail on this, but I think suffice it to say there's a variety of ways to make hydrogen with fossil fuels. Brown is with coal, gray is, I think, with natural gas, blue is fossil fuel with carbon capture and storage. And then we get into green, which is not using this steam methane reforming, but electrolysis, and with renewable sources, I think, is the green. And I haven't really heard of a color for nuclear. I heard gold was, a friend on Twitter said it should be gold because it should be the gold standard for making hydrogen.
Yeah, sure.
But I mean,
well, and this is, the colors are just such a distraction, to be honest. But
yeah,
it's cute. So maybe it helps some people sort of pass judgment on the different ways of doing it. And so what people are talking about today is not the kaleidoscope of different ways that hydrogen can be produced carbon free, because there's more than one way. They are exclusively talking about low temperature electrolysis. And there's different technologies that they're talking. I mean, there's different types of electrolyzer technologies, for example. So you can use alkaline, you can use PEM. There's some more exotic ones that are out there. But ultimately, they all rely on low temperature separation of hydrogen from oxygen. So water is the input, water and electricity, to produce a stream of hydrogen. Now, it's just worth pausing for a second and mentioning that the IEA has estimated that currently 0.1% of the world's hydrogen is produced like this. So like it's just pointing out the challenges to scalability.
Right.
Um, but yeah, low temperature electrolysis is what they're talking about. There are other options, like nuclear might have a really good role to play in high temperature electrolysis, right? Which is more efficient from a round trip efficiency perspective. You know, you basically, you're adding energy in the form of heat and you're electrolyzing the steam. And that makes the electrolysis process more efficient, happens more readily, and you get better efficiency like that.
Right.
To be honest, like it doesn't really matter because well, it does matter. It's important, but thinking about what we're going to use hydrogen for and how we're going to get it to the users is also the other part of the problem. So maybe we can sort of talk about the two reasons why we should be talking about hydrogen. And the first is fertilizers.
Mm-hmm.
So not all, but a very large portion of current hydrogen production in the world, which takes methane as a feedstock, is used to produce ammonia, which is obviously used to produce fertilizers. So if we didn't have synthetic ammonia produced by the Haber-Bosch process, the world's population, with the landmass that we have, the arable landmass we have, couldn't be more than about 2/3 of what it is today.
It's absolutely wild to think about. I'm again a big fan of Václav Smil, and he in lectures to students he says, "Okay, what's the most significant invention of the 20th century?" And he goes through a variety, you know, nuclear in terms of nuclear weapons or energy, and a number of other technologies. And he brings up the Haber-Bosch process, and you know there would be 4 billion less people on Earth, and it's just fundamentally because of the need for nitrogen to make proteins and to make DNA, you know, as the backbone of life. And it's just extraordinary. Also, just abstractly thinking about the ways in which, you know, we're changing the carbon cycle, and polluting the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, which has those climate implications. But this kind of parallel drawdown of the atmosphere in terms of, you know, 70% of the air is N2, and it's very hard to split that. And Haber-Bosch came up with that tool. And now we're stripping the hydrogen from the methane and tacking that together to make, I guess, N4 ammonia, which is the dominant way to get hydrogen into soils, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's how to fix nitrogen basically into the soils and into the into bio. So let's talk about what it would take just to decarbonize that sector for a second.
Yeah.
Let's forget about transport applications. Let's forget about grid level storage to compensate for intermittency renewable. Let's just talk about replacing Haber-Bosch.
Okay.
I read a paper the other day that estimated, and I'll send it to you so you can put the link in the chat notes. But it basically estimated that with current technology and some of the improvements that are reasonably near term and foreseeable, so not baked in but likely, and the way that we may be able to ramp hydrogen production, it's going to take nearly all of the world's industrial capacity just to decarbonize the production of ammonia for the next 50 or 60 years. I can't remember if it was 50 or 60.
Wow.
This is pretty close actually to the BP scenario. BP releases like an energy report every year. It's famous. It's widely cited. It's used to make investment decisions. They've got so the one that just came out this year, they've got a rapid growth scenario for hydrogen. Okay, and that's sort of what they think is the most achievable, using the best technology development and the biggest injection of funding. Very optimistic. And they've basically said that in the very best case, that by 2050, they don't think hydrogen can displace any more than 4% of current oil and gas usage. And if we look at where those products are used, particularly gas, that's about equivalent to what we use globally to produce ammonia. And so,
Right.
So you've got two separate sources there sort of coming to the same conclusion in different ways. So it's worth talking about how to make hydrogen efficiently, and we could talk about renewables, low temperature electrolysis. We could talk about nuclear high temperature electrolysis. There's methane pyrolysis, a different process again, which sort of more advanced nuclear reactors might be able to help out with. But there's like significant challenges there. That's before we even get on to the transport challenge. Okay, so like before we talk about transport, like it's worth talking about why this is worth talking about.
Sure.
So the best estimates, and sort of I've checked this with petrophysicists, geologists in my own industry, oil and gas. The best estimates that we have of how much oil and gas that the Earth has baked in over the last 2 billion years is that in the last approximately 150 years, we've used about 50%. This is excluding coal. This is just oil and gas. We've used about 50%. Okay.
And that includes the shale revolution. What is this? What's accessible easily? Is this just theoretically everything that's been deposited in the Carboniferous?
So this is what is not accessible easily, but accessible.
Okay.
Okay.
And how much can we trust that? Because I mean, we were talking about peak oil in the early 2000s, and then fracking came along and opened up the source rock, and now all estimates are out the window. I've got people telling, like Mark Mills was saying, listen, for all intents and purposes, 300-400 years of plentiful fossil. I don't know who to believe anymore.
Yeah, and like gas in particular is a difficult one, right? Because gas is turning up in places that was unexpected, frankly. Right. Underground water aquifers in different parts of the world are evolving methane, which was unexpected. We have methane from coal. We do have, shale. So there are, like methane in particular, there could be a bigger accessible inventory than we think, but not really with oil. Right. Oil is reasonably well understood and it's reasonably well characterized. We're not going to run out like tomorrow or anything like that. That's not what I'm trying to say. The point I'm making is that we think of oil as an energy product, but in fact, it's the single most important ingredient for literally thousands and thousands of different things. So roads need bitumen.
Right.
Active wear. Okay. You can't have active wear without oil. I'm always reminded of it whenever I drop the kids at school. Like, there's a lot. We're
talking like Lululemon tights and stuff like that, or
you got it. That does not exist without oil as an input to the process. Virtually, all our kind of modern electronics, all our plastics, Tupperware that keeps our food fresh. There's basically nothing. There's very, very few things that we rely on in the modern world that don't have oil as an ingredient somewhere along the line. Future generations will need those products. I think the people 50 years from now are probably going to want to wear Lululemon or something similar, right? They're going to want Tupperware to keep their food fresh. They're going to want roads to drive on.
Well, and I mean, also there's this idea that we should use natural fibers or whatever, right? I mean, certainly you pay a price premium for that, and you can wear, I guess, I'm not sure, hemp Lululemon. I mean, they probably won't be very comfortable. They're probably a bit scratchy and less stretchy. But I mean, those have real world impacts. And I mean, we talk about these energy transitions and the fact that coal, for all of the harm it's caused, saved English forests. And so there's big implications if we run out of that as a feedstock. And I mean, I'm not sure if Lululemon's become a carbon sink or like, you know what I mean? If they go to the landfill one day and they're buried, like, is that carbon neutral or not? But
yeah, I don't know how long that those hydrocarbon chains stay bound up in the fabric for. I got no idea, but
sure.
I mean, the point is, future generations have at least as much right as we do today to have these singularly useful and non-replenishable natural resources as an input to make these products.
Right.
So that's my position there, and it's not an original position. Lots of people share it. So we really need to start thinking about if we're looking at the second 50% of oil, let's say. So we've used the first 50%. We're looking at the second 50%. There's still plenty there. It's getting harder and harder to get out of the ground. All right. To give you an idea, when we first started producing oil, okay, in the late 19th century, both in Persia, but modern day Azerbaijan, I think, as well as in North America, the best estimates we have are that we would use 1 barrel's worth of energy, 1 oil barrel's worth of energy, and we would get 100 barrels of oil out of the ground.
Wow. Yeah.
So if you think about that in terms of energy return on energy invested, we were getting 100 out for 1 in. If we fast forward to today, the best estimates that we have, and this is aggregating like the super productive Middle Eastern fields with sort of the more marginal fields around the world, is 18 to 1. Okay, so what that means is we have to use the equivalent of a barrel of oil's energy just to get 18 out of the ground. That is going to continue happening. So it's fine to say, yeah, we got shale. We do have shale. Shale actually takes quite a bit of energy to release those hydrocarbons from the source rock. So, you know, there's still lots of reserves out there. Human ingenuity will definitely continue to play its part and eke out the efficiencies remaining. But to anyone who sort of thinks that this game is going to go on forever, like that should be enough to make you realize that, well, you know, 100 to 1 when we first started this, it's now 18 to 1. You know, where's it going to be in 50 years?
Right.
So these things are going to become more expensive. They're going to become more difficult to get out of the ground, and we should be preserving them for things like inputs to manufacturing, for which we have no replacement. Energy, on the other hand, we have lots of replacements.
Right.
Okay. We have wind, we have solar, we have uranium. You know, we may have thorium one day. Geothermal. There's a constellation of different types of energies we can use. So there's substitutes, but there's no substitutes for the manufacturing input. So, so getting back to transport, apologies for that digression, but getting back to transport, we at least need to consider how we substitute oil and gas, particularly oil, out of transportation applications. You know, and ring fence oil and gas for manufacturing inputs, right? And this is where we need to be sober and realistic, and it's a little bit of a gloomy story. That nothing that we invent in the next 10 to 20 years, and probably for a long way after that, is even going to come close to hydrocarbons in terms of how singularly useful they are and easy for transport applications. They're energy dense. They need very, very little refining, comparatively speaking, in terms of energy or in terms of technology or other inputs. They are safe to handle. They can be stored at basically at atmospheric pressure, atmospheric temperature. We have an entire supply chain that's, you know, nearly 150 years old, built up to transport it and to utilize it, both in vehicles, but also the upstream refueling stations and how we actually get it out of the ground, right? So extremely robust. Nothing that we're going to come up with in the most optimistic scenario is going to replace them like for like without any impact to transportation costs. And if we think about what that means, it means taking a decision to move away from hydrocarbons for transport applications is going to send the cost of transport up. That's virtually unavoidable if you want to try and ring fence hydrocarbons for future generations. Nate Hagen has done some really terrific work on this. I think he's over at the Institute for Energy Studies, Energy and Future Studies, and there's some others as well who have looked into the future and sort of said, well, when this plays out, how will this impact our lives and how will it impact our quality of life and the things that we're used to? And it's a very different world from the one we live in today. The listeners can sort of go and look up Nate and his work in their own time. It's really worth reading. So, you know, promising a silver bullet, either Elon Musk promising batteries are going to do it, or the other 1,000 spruikers that there are for hydrogen promising that they can displace hydrocarbons from these applications, is grossly irresponsible. Okay, they cannot replace hydrocarbons without a big impact to our quality of life and our standard of living.
And that's just because of global trade and the super tankers that get wedged in the Suez Canal that basically bring all the goods all over the world. And
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the transport miles that go into bringing any consumer product, not just consumer product, but food product,
right.
to your home, it's hard to
It's
fathom.
mind-boggling. Yeah, yeah.
It's truly hard to fathom, and that is all underwritten by oil and gas. So we can start to think about, well, what do we need to replace that? There's things we can do, like we can reduce the number of transport miles. You know,
Right.
we can manufacture things locally. There's movements that are sort of going down this way already.
Especially with COVID, right? You know, we're seeing the consequences of that with our inability to domestically produce masks, for God's sakes. And a year into
Yeah,
this at my hospital, we're still we're testing out these horrible elastomeric masks because we may still run out of N95s. It's been a goddamn year, people. Like, we're an industrialized country, or a deindustrialized country.
yeah. I mean, it's true, right? Like, so it's very hard to reverse supply chain decisions like that when they get baked in. They are reversible, but it takes a lot of time and effort
Yeah.
and significant cost.
So, I mean, in terms of that mechanism of trying to replace transportation fuel with hydrogen, I think, we don't need to dwell on that too much, but suffice it to say, it's not been successful with consumer passenger vehicles. If anything, batteries are sort of stealing the show there in terms of a potential replacement, but still lots of challenges to get them to anything like parity, and lots of ecological consequences in terms of, moving 500,000 pounds of earth to get a 1,000-pound Tesla battery. I mean, there's trade-offs, and there are potentially atmospheric gains, but it's not so simple. But something that I find fascinating is, we did a little brief show on this, and maybe this is the sort of humble steps that are taken, but sort of mixing hydrogen into existing fuel stocks. I mean, we did a show on Pro-Win Gas Vegan Plus, which is Greenpeace Germany actually sells a fossil fuel product that's 99%, I think, Russian methane gas, and they mix in 1% of electrolyzed hydrogen from wind and solar sources, and have greenwashed it as such. But in terms of using existing pipeline infrastructure, you mentioned that 150 years of hydrocarbon infrastructure. Some of the hydrogen hype I hear is that, well, we can just make this hydrogen greenly, electrolysis from wind and solar, and just put it into the existing fossil infrastructure. How realistic? You're shaking your head, but pop that balloon for
Yeah,
me.
I mean,
Is it just a question of scale, or is there other technological limitations? I mean, we've seen like liquefied natural gas has sort of taken a long time to establish itself, and it's continuing to grow, but involves compression and cryogenic storage. How does that compare to hydrogen?
sure. So, I mean, let's talk about the different ways hydrogen. So we've talked very briefly about how it can be produced, right?
Right.
But let's talk about the different ways that it can be stored, transported, and then utilized. So, hydrogen is gravimetric. Its gravimetric density is pretty good because it's such a light element. It's actually pretty energy dense when you look at it like that. But its volumetric density is very poor, okay, because it's such a it just is poor, right? So you can't you need to compress a lot of it, okay, into a space to get the volumetric density, just because of how small the molecule is, really.
So how many
And so
atmospheres are we talking? Like you said,
yes,
yeah.
about 700 bar
Okay.
is what you're talking about in most sort of fuel cell vehicles that we've looked at.
Okay.
So that they have a tank in them that that basically can be charged up to a maximum pressure of about 700 bar. Now that is a phenomenally enormous pressure.
What is that in
Now,
atmospheres? Do you know offhand? I just find
um,
that more comprehensible in terms of understanding, sea level pressures, and that's
yeah,
okay. We can throw it in the show notes.
yeah. So I mean, so 1 atmosphere, it's close to 1-to-1, right?
Really?
For kPa.
Okay.
So 101.3 kPa gives you a bar.
So
and
just
so
massive pressures.
But absolutely massive, like
Right.
way more than natural gas pipeline pressures, like absolutely phenomenal pressures.
Okay.
Now, the Japanese have developed technology to safely contain that, and it's been tested, and it's taken them 30 years, but they've got there. But just because it's possible doesn't mean it's sensible. And
I heard they shot a 50 caliber round through one of these tanks, and it doesn't explode because the hydrogen is under such pressure that it escapes. It doesn't let the oxygen in to actually lead to a combustion reaction. It's pretty fascinating little sidebar there.
Yeah, okay, I wasn't aware of that. And hydrogen does have the advantage that it dissipates extremely quickly.
Yeah.
So people worry about hydrogen explosions. It's not a negligible risk, but it is getting towards quite unlikely just because of how quickly it dissipates.
Right.
But you've still got this enormous pressure, and so now you've got to think about, well, okay, how do you get the hydrogen to the fuel station? You bring it as a liquid hydrogen, do you bring it as a pressurized hydrogen? And then you've got to store it at pressure, probably in underground tanks, maybe surface tanks or vessels at the fuel station. Then you've got to get it into people's cars. Now, it's not like a liquid where you just pump it. You've actually got to compress it into people's cars. And so what that means is, and this is where we go from, yeah, this is possible, to actually, is this really very sensible? Now, all of a sudden, you're running rotating machinery, you're running compressors at very high compression ratios in the middle of suburbia, in the middle of built up areas, to maintain these larger fuel tanks at this enormous pressure, so people can come and fill up quickly and drive off. And it's not that we don't have the technology to do it. It's just that that technology is usually used in industrial environments where you've got specially trained people, you've got comprehensive maintenance and inspection routines that are going through. It's away from the general public. It's operated by specialists, has dedicated engineered safety systems. It can be done in an industrial environment. It doesn't mean it's sensible to do it in built up areas and suburbia.
And I know I'm diverting from transportation here, but what about, this idea of using it in power plants, essentially to firm renewables? Like, I think Japan imports 90% of its energy in the form of fossil fuels, gas, coal, oil. And there's this idea that Australia can kind of coat itself in solar panels and windmills and create this green hydrogen, and there'll be a big market to take it to Japan. I think partially probably for transportation, but I think largely for firming a Japanese intermittent renewables fleet, or greening their current fossil uses. Is that storage implication and everything, does that apply at these massive scales, at these power plants where it would be conceivably being used?
So no, not for, it's just simply not going to be viable to do it as a gas. At that point, you would need to liquefy it. Which is, there's a pilot project that's happening in Australia right now, which I think will ship its first shipment of liquid hydrogen this year to Japan. Mm-hmm. But it's just a pilot project. There's no sort of long-term contracts or anything like that.
And to compress it, you need to get it. I think natural gas, you need to get it down to like -30, but hydrogen -170 or something.
No, well, the temperatures. So natural gas, to get it to ship it, it's -160 degrees.
Oh, okay.
To get hydrogen to liquefy, it's much, much colder. And so you have a trade-off between saying, well, the amount of energy to get it that cold and the metallurgy that we need, and the difficulties we're going to have engineering systems to go much, much colder than at scale. By the way, they can engineer the systems, but doing it at scale is a different thing. Well, liquid hydrogen means that you sort of go, well, let's bring the pressure up, and so you get this optimum point, and I do say optimum in air quotes, where you sort of bring the temperature of the hydrogen up, but you increase the pressure, and it still allows it to stay in the liquid form. So, natural gas as LNG is transported at basically atmospheric pressure, very slightly above atmospheric pressure, and a -160. But chilled hydrogen will have to be have to be transported at pressure.
Wow. Okay.
Because we just simply won't be able to chill it I'm going to say I hope I don't get this wrong. It's somewhere between 15 and 25 degrees above absolute zero.
Wow.
It's extremely cold, and so you need to add pressure to keep it as a liquid.
This show is reminding me so much of the fusion show, where it's like, great, this is a super cool idea, you know, scientifically it's demonstrated it's possible, but then when you look into the engineering implications, you go, wait a minute, like this is insane. And for this to form the basis of a new energy economy is madness, in terms of the, you know, the phantom electricity inputs just to keep your plasma going and your magnets going and everything. Like when you start to think about all these implications, you do start to see this helicopters crossing the Atlantic, or this Rube Goldberg machine.
Yeah.
That, you know, you talk about a pilot project and maybe politicians look at that and go, great, we can just scale that up. It's doable, it's feasible. And engineers, this other great part of this conversation with Mark Mills. He was saying, listen, like engineers thrive on problems, you know, and you throw something up, a barrier in their way, and they find a way around it. And that's what's really fun about engineering, but it's not always an intelligent solution, right? Or
definitely not, right? Definitely not. So you do need to take that 30,000 foot view. You need to have like that engineering talent working in the weeds, doing pilot projects on liquid hydrogen, doing pilot projects on ammonia. Like this is all really good stuff, and I think that basic research should be encouraged and funded. But you do need to have at a 30,000 foot view, engineers who take a more of a systems view, work with policymakers, work with investors and financial markets to say, listen, this may be possible. It may be possible in the future, but it's not sensible at the moment. This is not where we should be spending hundreds of billions of dollars of capital just yet. Let the research bubble along, do the pilot projects. They're a very small cost, and we'll see where it goes. But investing the money now with so much uncertainty, so much unproven technology, so much doubt about the ability to scale is, I don't know, it seems like the definition of madness, to me at least.
And are major investments being made in Australia on this? You said this pilot project, but I mean, I've heard about, you know, Australia becoming kind of the Saudi Arabia of hydrogen, or competing actually with Saudi Arabia, which is apparently planning on becoming a hydrogen power of some kind in their sort of post-oil transition plans. How far along are things in Australia in this regard?
Well, reasonably advanced insofar as our national science body, the CSIRO, is doing really sort of cutting edge research. They've oriented their research, best I can tell, they've oriented their research now towards ammonia, which is, and we'll touch on ammonia because I think ammonia has actually got some promise. I don't think anyone is talking about, not seriously anyway, talking about shipping liquid hydrogen anymore.
Right.
And definitely not compressed gaseous hydrogen. It's more or less a done deal that people are going to be shipping hydrogen in the form of ammonia. And there are projects.
And they already do for fertilizer, is what you're saying too, right? This idea would be to use it not just for fertilizer applications, but for energy potentially.
Yeah, absolutely for energy applications. So ammonia is not as easy to use as a fuel as, let's say, petrol, diesel, natural gas. But it has the advantage that it's easily stored. It's relatively transportable. We actually have a supply chain for transporting ammonia already. It's small, but it's at an industrial scale and can be scaled up. Its energy density is better.
Does it require Haber-Bosch like energetic inputs to make? Like, are we basically making a whole bunch of fertilizer and burning it?
Yeah, so you still need to produce the hydrogen
and the nitrogen, right?
Or well, no? The nitrogen you can get from the atmosphere.
But you need to crack it with Haber-Bosch, and that's energy intensive, and at present uses a lot of fossil, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. There's no getting away from that. Like there's no free lunch here. You need a lot of energy to make ammonia.
Okay.
And you need a lot more energy to make ammonia from electrolysis than using natural gas as an input.
Right.
So Yeah, but let's just say, with renewables and hopefully with nuclear, we can unlock that amount of energy. I think it's a big ask, to be honest, but let's just say it's possible. And we can produce ammonia. Ammonia is much more readily usable than straight hydrogen,
Right.
in terms of how to get it to the end user. It can be, and I was recently reading a report by DNV, which is one of the sort of premier marine classification societies. And in the maritime sector, it's nearly baked in now that they're going to be using either methanol or ammonia or both. So you've got the best engine manufacturers and researchers in the world at Wärtsilä, at MAN, at Caterpillar. The work they're doing is on ammonia.
Yeah.
And because it's got the benefit, you can combust it directly. You need to use a combustion promoter, like a diesel or anything. The flame propagation speed of ammonia is very poor, so you need to spike it to help it. And that's what they're working on now. The Japanese doing some good work, and those companies I mentioned. But it looks like it's probably going to have some promise for marine applications, provided we can produce it at scale for a reasonable cost.
This is to substitute for bunker fuel, or?
Yeah, for heavy fuel oil.
Wow.
Now
Which is just totally dirt cheap, because it's kind of the dredges of what's left over from refining hydrocarbons, right? But this application is for however many years out, when that energy invested of pulling oil out of the ground is low, or in 200-300 years when we actually fully run out. Is that why they're making these investments and exploring this?
Yeah, and there's also, like, the International Maritime Organization has set guidelines for
right
the carbon levels that they expect from the fleet over time, from the merchant marine fleet over time. So, these companies are investing on that basis. So, that's where they see the future, anyways, in ammonia and methanol, not in LNG and not in liquid hydrogen. So I think ammonia has some promise.
And like, do you like, for me, it's hard not to see this as just an attempt to sort of virtue signal, or to earn ESG investment dollars or something like that, because just when you look at, again, just the practicalities of it and the relative costs, I mean, it just seems like it's uneconomic.
It will never be as cheap as our current technology,
and it'll never, like, it seems like it'll never be a full substitution. And the other thing I wanted to touch on is just the relative energy efficiencies, because we touched on the various ways to make hydrogen, but in terms of, so let's say we use wind and solar, we do electrolysis, we create the fuel, we transport it, we burn it again. What are the kind of efficiencies that you get in and out from, let's just compare renewables and nuclear for this show in terms of those processes? I'm not sure if you have those numbers at your fingertips, but.
So the difference between nuclear and for making ammonia, let's say, the difference between nuclear and renewables is really only in the front end. And that's the difference between high temperature, like if we're talking about the hydrogen and ammonia supply chain and economy, is really only at the front end. So renewables may be able to be used at scale for low temperature electrolysis. There's big issues with running those plants, those low temperature electrolysis plants with intermittent energy. Like, they're not made to cycle up and down. That's not, they're a steady state industrial process that is not supposed to ramp. So you're also talking about large amounts of batteries to allow the process to cycle gently, or hopefully not at all. So the significant batteries required in order to couple solar and wind with low temperature electrolysis.
And this is beyond like having 100% renewables grid and doing this hydrogen thing. Like, we already talked about the overbuilds required to, either, provide firm power at low capacity factors, or overproduce so that you can charge batteries and discharge them when you're not producing. Like, someone, my science advisor, I'll call him, was saying, like, hydrogen only makes sense if you have an absolute sort of superfluity of energy, in terms of integrating it. Like, if you don't have enough energy, then there's no economic basis for it.
Yeah, that's true. And not only does energy have to be extraordinarily plentiful, but the technology to capture and then turn that energy into hydrogen has to be extremely cheap.
Right.
The capital cost of that equipment has to be extremely cheap, and it is not cheap. And there's reasons to think it will hit a cost floor below which it won't improve.
Right.
And that, you know, there's different reasons for that. The raw materials that have to go into the manufacture of electrolysis cells, you know, the catalyst in particular uses platinum group metals, which are rare and expensive, and easily damaged, it must be said, actually. So you have to have super pure water, which, I mean, I'm not sure about Canada, but in Australia, we don't have much water as it is. So we're going to be talking about desalinating water. And you can't just use desalinated water. You've got to use demineralized water. So it's got to go through distilled, right? It's got to go through another process to polish it down to, you know, basically neat H2O. All this is infrastructure. All this is energy. All it is it's more industrial inputs in order to just get the water. So yeah, all these things, like all these planets have to line up in order to make hydrogen work. And even then, it's not very convenient to use. Ammonia might be a little bit better. I kind of am open to seeing how the work on ammonia evolves. Like they're talking about, there's some research being done both in the US and in Australia now to produce ammonia directly in solid oxide, solid metal oxide fuel cells. And that they've been demonstrating it. It's got massive scaling challenges, but it's there. And so maybe you could have like an ammonia tank in your car, go to the petrol station, fill up, use an ammonia tank, ammonia in your car, and then at the point you need to use it in your hydrogen fuel cells, you convert that ammonia to hydrogen through an onboard reformer. Now that's got massive challenges too, because the ammonia will destroy that fuel cell if it bypasses. You know, so you need to be converting nearly 100% of that ammonia to hydrogen, because if any ammonia gets through, which it always does in industrial processes, if any of it gets through, it's going to destroy your fuel cell. So the technical challenges are absolutely massive.
So kind of revisiting that earlier point, like so many of these, again, I call them Rube Goldberg machines. I'm using that term a lot just to define it. I mean, I think it was a cartoonist who created these elaborate contraptions involving, you know, parrots eating a cracker that then released a string that lit a rocket that launched, and, you know, anyway, that results in actually it's a mustache getting cleaned with a handkerchief, right? But, you know, these incredibly complex systems, which maybe are an engineer's wet dream because they love solving problems, but so much of it seems to be because of the avoidance of nuclear, because nuclear does, you know, it's a much more simple plug-in in terms of our, at least in terms of electricity, in terms of our current grids, you know, not needing to build enormous amounts of transmission. I mean, just the idea of using hydrogen to firm renewables output versus nuclear, it's just so much simpler, it seems to me. But because of this societal aversion to nuclear, we're on this kind of fool's quest to create something else that might work. I mean, I'm biased. I mean, maybe you're biased as well. I mean, it's interesting because you had the experience of working in the oil and gas sector. You've been a renewables developer, investor, and you're also working with DUNE. So maybe kind of in closing, what's your take on that? What we've talked about like niches where hydrogen, we need to decarbonize fertilizers. That's enough of an enormous challenge and worthy of investment in figuring out how to make hydrogen in a low carbon way. But in terms of its, I guess, kind of summarizing here in terms of its real world applications and that question around nuclear, how do you see things?
Yeah, I mean, it is the case that we are, as a society, as an economy, turning ourselves inside out, like folding ourselves into pretzels to try and avoid using nuclear energy. Now, don't get me wrong, like nuclear has got a little bit of work to do on itself. So particularly in Western nations, right? Like it has to get cheaper to build. But these problems are well understood, they're well known, and they're solvable, right? Like we used to do it, so we can do it again. It's not relying on some future technological development.
But it's solvable with the politics to make it possible. And I think that's part of why you originally reached out to me, right? Is you know, these nuclear buildouts, you know, Korea, France, Canada, like I'm not sure. The states, I think, is I mean, it had state support to begin with for sure, but I mean, these are the product of a bygone era, it seems, in terms of whether it's a social democratic politics or just a non-neoliberal politics where there's, you know, state-owned enterprises or crown corporations in Canada that could carry these projects forward. I mean, I think that seems to be the major barrier, not the technology. We've done it before. We should be able to do it again, but we've deindustrialized and we have a kind of neoliberal financing model, which is not favorable to the juggernaut of getting nuclear moving, which is what it takes to get it cheap. You got to get this freight train built and moving, and then as a supply chain and industry, it can achieve what it has in the past. But
so I mean, the finance sector, investment generally will reorient towards nuclear energy if they see a government that is committed to it.
right.
So, but the commitment's got to come in a number of ways. So that means a government that's going to stand up a regulatory structure that is repeatable, that is understood in advance, that is, you have a fairly high surety of costs. You know, these last minute surprises or changes to design as you're going, or changing regulations midway through a project, that stuff's got to stop. Okay, so, and you know, government and regulators know that, that's well understood. But government also needs to, like in Australia, for example, like they turned around and slapped on a ban back in 1998. Like if they were to remove that ban, what's to say that they're not going to turn around and put it back on again? And if you're building infrastructure that lasts between 60 and 100 years and has payback times of, well, over 15 years in many instances, right? Because electricity is a very cheap, low margin commodity. You can't afford that political risk. Yeah. You also have market risk. Like if you're in a market where renewables can dump, you know, solar and wind can dump significant amounts of energy into the grid when they want at zero marginal cost, and you have to compete with that, then you know, you're really going to struggle. You need to know that you can sell 85, 90% of your full nameplate capacity for a given price. So there are things the government can do. And if the government shows in any country that it is committed and that it wants this as part of its you know, energy solution, yeah, I mean, I think industry and the finance sector will step up. But at the moment, the subsidies and tax benefits and everything like that are for renewables, and that's where the investment's going to keep going.
Right.
Listen, I don't think there's any way of avoiding large-scale deployment of nuclear energy in the medium term. I mean, the laws of the universe that are sort of baked in at the level of physics suggest that we will have to get there at a certain point. And I'm sure we will when things get bad enough and energy gets expensive and all that sort of thing, hopefully before then. But the damage, significant damage will be done in the meantime. So, you know, I guess a message to sort of to policymakers, not that any might be listening, but a message to policymakers is you're making decisions that have decades and decades of implications, consequences. You're making decisions for a generation who's not even born yet, but who will have to live with those consequences. And you need to make the most sensible option. Not trying to pick winners about what's possible or what might be possible in the future. What's possible now and what's sensible now. And, you know, look at it critically, look at nuclear critically. Like I think that has to be done. Use like a red team, blue team approach to bring yourself up to speed with all the different trade-offs, all the different constraints that there are. And when you do that, unavoidably you get to nuclear. And that's, you know, for me, that's how I sort of got there, you know, after trying to get some solar projects off the ground. You know, we just realized that unless it was going to be subsidized indefinitely, that we weren't going to make money. And then you start to peel back the layers of the onion about, well, why does it need to be subsidized indefinitely? And you realize that at a technical level, 100% renewables is just simply not sensible, practical, and may not even be possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I reoriented to nuclear. I truly see it as inevitable. And if we are to stand up like an ammonia economy to substitute for transport fuels, taking away the fact that that is going to be enormously expensive in its own right, and that's going to hurt us as a society. We should be trying to do it in the most efficient way, and that's probably going to be with nuclear, high temperature electrolysis, eventually.
Mm-hmm. Well, James, I think we're a little bit past an hour now. I could talk all day, or I guess it's day for you, evening for me here. Really informative conversation. I stepped into this with a bare bones understanding, and obviously there's so much more we could go into. But I think we touched on the key points and drew some interesting conclusions. Is there anything else you wanted to add, or?
Not really. I mean, there's lots of things we didn't talk about. We didn't talk about synthetic fuels.
Right.
We didn't really talk about batteries. All these have niche applications within transport. That they're worth talking about in their own right. And I really want listeners to understand, I guess, or at least be open to the fact that this is not about picking winners. That it's not like a battery versus hydrogen versus synthetic fuel thing. All of them will be needed to eventually transition away from the fossil fuels that, as David McKay said in his book, Sustainable Energy, which is the first and last word on energy sobriety, like we are benefiting from 2 billion years worth of accumulated energy reserves.
Right.
We're going to need every solution in the book to replace them.
Yeah. Okay, James. Well, certainly, maybe we'll have to have you back to talk about synth fuels and batteries at some point. All right.
Sure, I look forward to it.
All right. You have a great day down under, and got you queued up on the globe right here. It's my little gimmick these days for those who are watching on video. All right. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely a pleasure. We'll talk again soon.
Take care, mate.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.